So when I was in government, one of the things that I would be told by other government officials is, oh, we don't want to talk about LGBTQI issues around elections because, there's so many issues that are, really occupying the national debate. And I always thought this was like a joke because show me a national election in the US or almost any country around the world where coverage of LGBTQI issues don't during elections. Spike during elections because politicians weaponize LGBTQI people to turn out their base.
Today, we're delighted to speak with Jessica Stern, a highly respected activist on global LGBTQI plus rights. Jessica just recently launched the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice, so she'll tell us what she's doing in this alliance, why LGBTQ plus rights matter to foreign policy and to diplomacy, and what she was most proud of in her role as special envoy on LGBTQ plus rights during the Biden administration. So let's hear what Jessica has to say. Welcome to the Famous Podcast. Today we're really delighted, I'm very delighted to welcome Jessica Stern to this conversation. Jessica is a highly respected advocate for the rights of LGBTQI plus people, and she is the co-founder and principal of the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice, as well as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Jessica was the US Special Envoy for LGBTQI rights in the Biden administration. And before that, she was the executive director of Outright International, a global LGBTQI plus rights organization. Jessica and I first worked together in connection with UN diplomatic negotiations on sexual and reproductive health and rights, where she helped create a core group of member states committed to LGBTQI rights, and where the LGBTQ caucus and the Women's Rights Caucus struck a very productive alliance in the 2010s. No, in no short, small part, thanks to Jessica's sharp strategic sense and also her collaborative posture. So it's a real pleasure to have her on the podcast today.
It's a real honor to be here with you.
Oh,
I've always been a big fan, and I can honestly say we made very good trouble together.
we did. Only the best kind.
Well, one thing that I could just say, I know you're still introducing me, but one of the things that
Go
made
ahead.
our relationship important was that you were leading the International Women's Health Coalition, and IWHC led the Women's Rights Caucus at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And what was so remarkable about your leadership was that you welcomed an LGBTQI plus rights organizations into that WRC space with open arms.
Yes. No, that was definitely important to us.
You modeled leadership and inclusion,
Mm,
and it really made it possible for us to maintain a feminist space,
yeah.
um, one where women's rights and LGBTQI rights would thrive together.
Yes, that's right. Because I feel very strongly that that has to be the case. But I'd like you to kick us off by talking about this. You've worked on LGBTQI rights all your career, pretty much, right? And when I invited you to come on this podcast, which is Feminism Makes Us Smarter, you said yes. So, can you tell my listeners why, first of all, LGBTQ rights are so important to you personally, but
Mm.
also how you see them relate to feminism? Why did you agree to come on a feminist podcast today?
Well, because there could be no greater honor than being on a feminist podcast as a feminist and a feminist activist. Well, let me start with your first question. LGBTQI rights are important to me for many reasons. I'm a queer person myself, and if I don't fight for my rights, how can I expect anybody else to do it? Um, in the current climate, there's significant backlash against LGBTQI
Yes.
plus people, especially trans people.
Yes.
And so those of us who have the skills and the courage to speak out need to take up space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I work globally, and I can say, having the international overview, there's no country on the planet where LGBTQI plus people are completely safe.
Right.
There's always this fantasy that you can flee to this place that's like the nirvana at the end of the rainbow.
Sweden or yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
like, some people say Sweden, some people say New York City, some people say Buenos Aires,
Hmm.
but there's no place that is perfectly safe for LGBTQI people, and so I keep doing this work because I think everybody should live with dignity,
Mm-hmm.
and that your sexual orientation, your gender identity or expression, your sex characteristics should not undermine your full humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say I really figured that out because of feminism. I was a feminist a before I knew I was queer,
Hmm.
and I have a degree in women and gender studies.
Ah.
And so the first thing I learned is that if you wanna understand the experiences of women and girls, you have to understand age, race, ability, health status, sexual orientation, nation, gender identity, all of the intersecting vectors that can determine how much equality someone enjoys in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've sort of ended up doing the really hard work my whole life because nobody likes feminists or queers, or at least they don't like us enough.
That's right.
I like feminists and queers. I think you like feminists and queers.
Definitely. But it's true.
But
A lot of people love to hate on us, right?
they do, which is why those of us who know that our vision is inclusive and our vision is just need to stand shoulder to shoulder to each other and tell our stories.
Hmm. And you've alluded to this question. My next question is about, what is the state of globally of LGBTQI plus rights. I mean, and Sweden may not be the place where we can seek refuge, but why? Like, what is going on globally? What have you observed? And you've had different vantage points. You've been a US special envoy, in the US government, but you've also been the executive director of Outright International. So that's a civil society perspective on the issues globally. How are we doing globally on these issues?
Um, well, I wish I could give you happy news
Hmm.
because, and I think over the course of our lifetime, I will have more optimistic things to say. But it's very hard for LGBTQI plus people around the world. There are roughly 60 countries that criminalize consensual homosexual acts, which is just hard to comprehend in
Mm-hmm.
2025. You know, we share that statistic and people almost like glide over it, but it means that in roughly one third of the countries on the planet, you don't have a right to a sexuality if you're gay or lesbian.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what your sexuality is, as long as you're not hurting someone else, as long as it's consensual, as long as it's, with another human being, um, then we want to create space for that because sexuality is fundamental to what it means to be human.
Right.
And I wish I could say that these laws weren't applied, but in many countries, sodomy laws are applied and used to arbitrarily arrest people,
Mm-hmm.
um, bring criminal charges against them. People are fined or whipped and spend years in prison just for being themselves. And that has a ripple effect, a stigmatizing effect that can follow you the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond prison sentences, unfortunately, there are roughly 10 countries in the world that punish homosexuality with the death penalty. And that also is just a fact that shocks me because I oppose the death penalty on all grounds. But even if you were to believe that the death penalty has value, you would probably argue that it should only be applied in the most egregious cases. And impossible for me to comprehend that my loving relationship with my partner
Right.
is one of the most egregious acts in a society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the sort of legal context. I would say in terms of attitudes, it's we've been going up and down. We've been seeing progress on LGBTQI issues in a lot of places, and we've been seeing backlash.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started doing this work more than 25 years ago, you didn't find LGBTQI organizations in many countries because there was so much social stigma. It was shameful and embarrassing and dangerous to be a member of an LGBTQI organization. Today, almost every country on the planet has an LGBTQI organization. So we've made progress.
Right.
And we've also seen historic leaps forward in terms of social acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just talking with a friend who was telling me about P Flag Uganda. So, LGBT so moms in Uganda that are standing up for their LGBTQI
Oh,
children. So
wow.
progress is happening, but there's no question, Françoise, we're in a time of backlash where LGBTQI people are really being weaponized and it's being used to justify, I think, undermining the rule of law for all.
Mm-hmm. And in some cases, some countries like Uganda, unfortunately, but also Russia, Hungary, it's really been driven by a far right movement, and in some cases, a far right government that's really decided to pick that issue as the issue they're going to use to mobilize their base, right? Attacking the Pride Parade, incarcerating people, changing the laws to make homosexuality a crime in Uganda, a crime punishable by life in prison or even death. So, really very dangerous positions that have, as you noted, real bearing on people's lives. But there's a political dynamic there, no?
I think so. I mean, we often say that LGBTQI people are a canary in the coal mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I never say the canary in the coal mine, I say a canary in the coal
Yeah,
mine,
there's a few.
because in one situation where migrants are the most pilloried or scapegoated, it's migrants. In another place, it's Muslims. In some places, it's unmarried women
Mm-hmm.
or teen moms. But
Mm-hmm.
the way you test the rule of law is not how it treats the most privileged, but how it treats the most marginalized. And LGBTQI people's, you know, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of school dropout, lower life expectancy, um, lower self-esteem. These are all markers that we're failing people. We're failing the most marginalized. And so, in a context where LGBTQI people have less status, and then it becomes really easy for politicians to weaponize them.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in government, one of the things that I would be told by other government officials is, oh, we don't want to talk about LGBTQI issues around elections because, there's so many issues that are, really occupying the national debate. And I always thought this was like a joke because show me a national election in the US or almost any country around the world where coverage of LGBTQI issues don't during elections.
Right.
Spike during elections because politicians weaponize LGBTQI people to turn out their base.
Mm-hmm.
So what did we hear about? What did President Trump invest money in the last weeks of his campaign?
Attacks on trans people. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what was one of his day one executive orders?
Mm-hmm.
Attacks on trans people.
That's right.
So anyone who thinks that this is a marginal issue really isn't paying attention to the amount of political power that it has accumulated. And I think that's an argument for people on all sides of the political spectrum to just respect LGBTQI people.
Yeah.
Like maybe you don't care about me, maybe you don't care about my rights, but probably you'd like to have a meaningful political debate so that we all have access to clean drinking water, safe neighborhoods, prosperous economies.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it's possible to distract people by focusing on those people, those gays, those transgender, then really it undermines conversations about democracy for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So secure a consensus on those rights so that we can move on together with LGBTQI people to advance a range of issues. Yeah. I mean, that's unfortunately, you're right. Like the Trump administration really weaponized attacks on trans people during the elections and continue to. I mean, they're still going for it. Why do you think? Can we unpack this together a little bit? Why specifically trans people? Why are they such a target right now?
Well, first I just want to say it's so painful.
It's
It's
terrible.
just
It's just
I
it's
just like can't I
outrageous.
can't believe that in 2025 we have to make arguments that all people matter. I mean, that's
Right.
really what it's a proxy for.
Right.
Do you believe that all people matter?
Mhm.
Even people that might be a little bit unfamiliar to you. Do
Mhm.
do they still have access to equal rights? So, um I struggle to understand the cruelty that justifies the dehumanization of trans people, but I
Mhm.
have some theories about why it's happened. One reason that I think it's been able to take off is because, um, from the perspective of movement strategy, we started saying LGBT or LGBTQI plus or queer
Mhm.
as shorthand for what was essentially an assertion of rights
Mhm.
of very different people. But the truth is, my neighbor, my colleague at work, the person at the grocery store has probably been learning about gay and lesbian and bisexual issues for a very long time, right? They're not new. Transgender people are not new, but the articulation of a transgender rights agenda is newer.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't really understand what transgender even means,
Right.
right? Does it mean that someone changes their body? Does it mean that they keep their body as it was assigned at birth, but they change their pronouns?
Mhm.
So I think confusion and misinformation and lack of familiarity is part of it. I think another piece, because it's important to consider where we can take responsibility and do better within social justice movements. I think that in our fervor to make sure that we um, have made transgender people be seen, we've been a little bit unforgiving when people have made mistakes
Mhm. Mhm.
and when we've misgendered people, when we've used the wrong name. And I think the principle that we really have to apply is we're not canceling you if you get it wrong, but you're trying your best to show respect and love.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Call you
and
in, not call you out.
like that is the lesson for the left, right? We haven't been that good at calling people in.
Mhm.
And then the last piece I would say is, I think as people have started to deconstruct the gender binary
Yes.
and to say gender equality is relevant in their lives, it's brought this flourishing of creativity and potential that has served all of us. Like when I was a kid, the gender roles were so stratified. And now, I look at my straight cisgendered brother who's the primary chef in his house and does equal childcare and took parental leave when his kids were born. These things have actually, the expansion of the possibility of gender has benefited all of us.
Mhm.
But for those that are dead set on traditional conservative ideas about how a man and a woman should be and
Yeah.
that there's nothing else,
Mhm.
this flourishing is really destabilizing.
Yeah. One of the things that I have to say has bothered me a bit, even though I don't want to cancel people who make mistakes, is that some very powerful political figures have not been bold and brave in their defense of trans folks. In fact, someone like
Right.
Governor Gavin Newsom of California
Yeah.
invited Charlie Kirk, the far right provocateur who was assassinated, as the
Yeah.
first guest on his podcast, right, this year. Uh, and then he proceeded in his first conversation in that podcast to agree with Kirk that trans people were problematic in that allowing trans
Mm.
athletes in girls' sports was deeply unfair. And I was really disappointed with that. I mean,
Yeah.
there we have a problem, even, yeah, calling in, calling out, but some people who should know
Right.
better and should educate themselves are really eager to join the far right. So I wonder what you say to that.
Mm.
Were you
I have a lot of
disappointed with
things to
him?
say. I've got no time for that.
No, no.
I mean, I've got no time for kicking people out. I have a lot of time for welcoming people in.
Mhm.
So I'm willing to accept that we could be better at explaining our priorities, using inclusive language, steering away from jargon. I think we need to describe our values rather than be so wed to specific terminology. But I have no time for excluding, marginalizing, and worsening the situation for transgender people. All
Mhm.
the data about transgender people's lives says the same thing. High discrimination results in lower employment and higher violence.
Yes.
It is a tragedy. And so, what I would really want to see from political leaders is an insistence that we will not sacrifice any among us, especially the most vulnerable, in our quest for power.
Mhm.
Why have political power if not to use it for good?
Right. Yeah,
I
and
think,
sorry, go ahead.
I just say, I think this is a real fissure in the left right now. There are those who want power at any cost, and there are others, and I suspect you and I are in the other camp, which says we will only succeed by being insistent on welcoming everybody in.
That's right. And I mean, I've also been disappointed with some feminists, people who call themselves feminists or who I considered allies in many cases, who then, say something similar. They don't feel comfortable with trans issues and they wouldn't want a trans girl in their girls, in their daughter's team, etc. And I'm prepared to explain things to them, but I'm surprised people are so confused, because I thought we all agreed that it's my body, my choice, and all of a sudden it's not. So I
Right,
just,
exactly.
I mean, you got to do your homework a little bit. Like you got to, again, I think some people, I excuse some people, but other people, you got to educate yourself, and if you're a feminist activist, you can't tell me you haven't bothered to figure this out, right? And but how are we going to sort ourselves out, though? I think we need as a movement. You're right. The left needs as a series of movements because we're not just one movement
Mhm.
to figure this out together, especially the
Mm.
feminist movement.
Well, I mean, you're pointing to one of the other problems that has created the situation that enables Gavin Newsom to distance himself from transgender people. And it's the false divide between a feminist political agenda or a women's rights agenda and LGBTQI or trans equality. And one of the things I think binds you and me together is that we're feminists that believe that anyone who experiences discrimination on the basis of gender deserves support,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, and there's that term, trans exclusionary radical feminist, but I reject the premise of that term
I agree.
because the feminism that I learned was exactly what you just said, which is my body, my choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that through work in solidarity with those that were fighting for access to birth control, that were fighting for access to abortion, that were fighting to decide when to have children and how many children to have. Like these are fundamental feminist
That's
principles.
right.
And so it has to extend to respecting transgender people's choice about whether to modify their body, how to modify their body, and also the desire to decouple the body from what it means to be a woman or a man
Right,
or non binary.
right. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir said, "We're not born women; we become women." So
Exactly.
if you believe that, then you have to support trans rights because you realize that biology and gender are two different things altogether. And I do want the freedom to also express my gender the way I want, right? I don't want to be tied to a certain mode of expression or, what kind of presentation I have to give at any time. And that's a lot of people agree with that, in fact. And yet, yeah, we're really confused. We're going to need to figure out a way to get together and sort this out in the feminist movements because this cannot go on. And I agree with you. Anybody who calls themselves exclusionary, I don't know how they can be feminists at the same time, if you exclude an entire group of people. Yeah.
It also means we have to not take the bait. So, one example of this is trans athletes.
Mm.
Are there trans athletes? Yes, of course.
Yes.
Are there a lot of trans athletes?
No.
No. There just aren't a lot of trans people.
That's right.
And within the category of trans people, some are artists, some are lawyers, some are athletes. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but the historians are going to look back, they're going to use the AI of the future, and they're going to look back at our public record from 2025, and they're going to think there were packs of thousands of trans athletes roving the streets based on the amount of time we spend on this issue.
That's right.
That's a red herring.
Right.
We have to avoid that kind of distraction. And,
Mm-hmm.
instead of talking about participation in sports all the time, we should be using the space to talk about, who has a right to be safe from violence? Who has a right to be seen before the law and
Mm-hmm.
access to legal identity?
Mm-hmm.
For example, I think it was 2 weeks ago, um, that the Trump administration took some additional step to eliminate the validity of the X gender marker on US
Right.
passports. When I was the US Special Envoy for LGBTQI rights, I worked on the development of the X gender marker passports and I launched them publicly.
Mm.
And I have to say, Françoise, I thought it was such an important development for people's safety
Yes.
because I have been at countless border crossings with people who don't whose gender expression does not conform to the gender marker in their passport.
That's right.
And it has created confusion for the border agents, and it has created lack of safety for the non-binary or trans person with very serious consequences.
Sure. It's
Because if
dangerous,
I
right?
look like this,
Yeah.
feminine,
And it
and I
says
present
man.
a passport with an M in the passport, I'm going to be accused of impersonation or fraud.
Right. Right.
So why would we remove a government document that actually solves a problem?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the question asked is the question answered, right? You do want to eradicate these people's existence. I mean, that's what this is about, right? It's a profound form of hatred. Now, of course, I don't want to just getting back to the trans athlete, even if there's only two trans athletes in collegiate sports, which is actually the case, I think, when the director of the NCAA was testifying before Congress last year, he was asked how many trans athletes there was in collegiate sports, and he said less than 10. And I think fewer than 10. And I think the answer is actually fewer than five. But even those fives, athletes deserve protection. But it's important to point out that we're talking about a very vulnerable small group of people who are being weaponized and attacked for political gain. It has nothing to do with a real social problem we're trying to solve. It's actually engineered to cause outrage, even though now, let's talk about your role as special envoy for LGBTQ rights or during the Biden administration. Uh, First of all, was this the first time there was a special envoy on LGBTQI rights, or were you the first one?
Um, the position was established by President
Uh
Obama,
huh.
who appointed a career Foreign Service officer, an extraordinary person, who had never before worked on LGBTQI rights, but
Okay. Yeah.
we got lucky that he was very smart and a fast learner, but he was not an expert. And then the position was dormant under Trump's first administration,
Mm-hmm.
and reestablished by President Biden. And I served as the first human rights expert in that role. And unfortunately, I'm also the last US Special Envoy for LGBTQI rights because the position has no longer exists.
That's right. I mean, it might be revived in the future. We gotta keep hoping. So, what do you feel you were able to achieve in that role? I mean, what is a special envoy? I know the U.S. government appoints a range of them on different topics. What are their roles, and what do you feel you were able to achieve? What are you proudest of?
Well, so for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with the concept of a special envoy, it's basically like the equivalent of being an ambassador, but
Mm-hmm.
it tends to be focused on a human rights or thematic issue.
Mm,
So there was special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and rights, special envoy on global youth concerns. They sometimes use the title special representative on international labor affairs,
right.
disability, racial equity, and justice. Um, and so it's a way of creating a senior diplomatic position who is seized with typically a human rights abuse. Um, and so, in this capacity, I led US foreign policy on LGBTQI concerns. And that became an excellent way to amplify our legal and social progress on these issues
Mm-hmm.
to help LGBTQI people who are the victims of danger in countries around the world. I didn't have a domestic mandate,
Okay.
but of course, I know that things were not perfect for LGBTQI people in the United States. So I would really work from a principle of humility. Who am I to tell other countries what to do? Um, but what I tried to do was to ensure that if LGBTQI people were arbitrarily arrested, that we would use in another country, we would raise it as the US government because
Mm-hmm.
governments, in the context of their bilateral relationship, talk about everything. They talk about economics, they talk about security, they talk about climate change. And whether or not they talk about human rights is a value statement. And so I would try to make sure that we did talk about the human rights of LGBTQI people, because if we didn't raise these issues, well, silence is consent.
Right.
And in my role, what I did was I worked with our embassies around the world to ensure that they understood what was happening for LGBTQI people at the country level.
Mm-hmm.
I worked constantly with LGBTQI activists on the front lines and really worked as hard as I could to amplify their priorities. And I worked with our colleagues in Washington, D.C. to ensure that in multilateral levels and in every senior government statement that human rights of LGBTQI people were taken into account.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say you're most proud of during those 4 years? You talked about the passports, the US passports that have the next gender marker so that if people didn't want to identify as male or female, they could identify as X, which would help them cross borders safely, right?
Um, I was proud that we helped pass the first ever resolution on intersex rights at the UN Human Rights Council.
Ah.
I was proud that we had the second ever Security Council aria on LGBTQI people in war and conflict. I was proud that when the LGBTQI movement of Japan was fighting for its first ever federal non-discrimination law, we backed them. And while that law that they wanted didn't pass, a different version passed, an LGBT awareness bill, which is the hardest step. It's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
I was proud that in one country that shall remain nameless, I had a series of extremely consequential meetings where I presented them with data about so-called conversion therapy practices in their country.
Mm-hmm.
And the result was they announced the depathologization of homosexuality in their country and that conversion therapy practices would be banned from all federal healthcare facilities.
Wow.
There were just so many, Françoise. It's a blessing and a curse,
Mm-hmm.
but governments really do talk to each other and
Right.
influence each other.
Right.
And so serving in government is not for everyone,
Mm.
but I would wish that we would have more human rights diehards in government so that we can use that power for good.
Mm-hmm. Well, this sounds exciting and also open to creativity on your side, right? It's whatever. Of course, listening to what the community was bringing to you, but also figuring out where you could move the issues. Yeah, yeah. Must have been exciting.
It was. And, unfortunately, there just aren't a lot of countries in the world that have the power and might of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the US funds roughly a quarter of the UN's annual budget. The US and China tie for who has the most embassies around the world. When I left the State Department, it had 80,000 employees in comparison with another government that's lucky to have 500 employees in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Right, right.
So, the US just wields disproportionate power on the world stage. And that's why this position was so tactically important. Because when the US would draw attention to an issue, it would change the discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And as we especially know now, can change the discourse for the better,
Oh, the
or it can
worst.
really erode human rights.
Right. And now that we're facing a very different scenario for foreign policy, US foreign policy, you've recently founded the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice with 7 other former ambassadors, all former US diplomats and all women, I noticed. Tell me why you felt that was needed at this time. What made you think that that was the step you needed to take?
Um, we were we developed relationships with each other because we each had human rights portfolios in the Biden administration. We were
Mm-hmm.
each senior diplomats, but we also all knew what it meant to have to really fight for human rights to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And quite a number of us that subsequently formed the alliance um, came together in protest of the Biden administration's policy on Gaza, for
Yeah.
example.
Mm-hmm.
And we fought to stop weapons transfers to Israel and for recognition that Israel was responsible for a genocide of Palestinians.
Wow.
And so we saw the consequences of a US foreign policy that incorporated human rights but didn't center human rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this strategy is bad for the world and bad for Americans. I could make I could make arguments about my moral compass. I think fighting for human rights is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But I can also make arguments that are transactional or even conservative and say that fighting for human rights around the world burnishes the US's reputation.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us a more desirable economic partner.
Mm-hmm.
It ensures that American workers are not competing with slave labor in another country. It ensures that our domestic and foreign policy uphold the same standards, which is essential because if we don't maintain that standard, our foreign policy can become a laboratory of bad ideas that are then imposed on Americans at home.
Right.
So, our ambition is to center human rights in US foreign policy. Now, obviously, your listeners know what the political situation in the US is right now.
Yes.
So, short term, we're trying to mitigate the harm.
Mm-hmm.
So, stop bad things from happening where we can. For example, the bureau that I used to be based within, the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor at the State Department, has largely been dismantled by the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So we've done everything that we can to staunch the bleeding. Long term, we're trying to write a blueprint that charts another way forward. There is a better way.
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
can do better.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to your earlier question about Gavin Newsom's wobbling on trans issues. Like the way forward is by being more ambitious for human rights. And I think that's part of the reason that we actually keep losing in political elections in the US because we're not sufficiently ambitious and we don't sufficiently deliver. And
Right.
so the alliance is saying, not on my watch.
Mm-hmm.
We demand more.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, Gavin Newsom, wobbly, or I mean, frankly, throwing people under the bus, altogether. And that's been true of the Democratic Party in some respects, also on this issue. I wanted to hear more from Kamala Harris on Gaza. I didn't. during the campaign. I wanted to hear her speak on trans issues. She didn't, those who accuse her of having been too woke during the campaign didn't follow the same campaign I did, and I supported her, of course, but I did not, to your point, I did not hear that bold posture on human rights. And of course, I mean, the US foreign policy has always been very disingenuous, in my view, on issues of human rights. The US has presented itself as a beacon of human rights since the Second World War, and with that whole, we're, promoting democracy and human rights, and yet has been leading, terrible human rights violations in many cases, Chile, Haiti, Cambodia, Vietnam, Iran. I mean, we can keep listing the horrors that we've been associated with in our foreign policy. So um, it seems to me it's going to be a steep hill to climb. No, because it's not as though we used to be respectful of human rights in our foreign
Yeah,
policy. I think we did talk a good game in many cases. Sometimes did some good, but also at the same time would topple governments and torture people and invade them, like the invasion of Iraq, which was, like, to me, a devastating blow that I don't think we've ever recovered from. It does harm us, yeah, to to do these things. It does harm us and
exactly.
and our influence. No, um, but yeah, it's a tall order. But I agree with your your vision. It's just
How do we get there?
how are you gonna get there? Yeah, what do you think?
Honestly, I think that the days of American hegemonic power are behind us.
Mm-hmm.
And in a multipolar world, the only option is to show respect for human rights and international norms and standards. And you look at what the US is doing around the world right now, flexing military power, imposing tariffs. We are hated.
Yeah.
I mean, I just came back from a trip abroad. I was with quite a number of current government representatives, and the US is a laughing stock. I mean, you know, other governments are happy when the US doesn't participate. I mean,
Right.
what a tragedy. So
Yeah.
it's going to take years and generations to rebuild. And so we can't rebuild by just being adequate. We
Mm.
can't rebuild by simply not disrespecting our allies. We're going to have to rebuild by delivering something that really inspires governments and countries and people that we've insulted and oppressed to have a reason to give us another chance.
Right.
And I think this is the only way. I'm not just saying this as a, lofty dreamer. I'm saying this as someone who understands that American political might depends on offering something to the world,
Mm-hmm.
especially after this episode of horror. So, and I believe we can. Other countries have come back. I mean, Poland, you know, what, 4 years ago had don't say gay zones. It's not don't say gay zones. Sorry, that's us. That's Florida. Had LGBT free zones.
Yes.
And today they're trying to incorporate human rights nationally, bilaterally, and globally. South Africa once had apartheid
Right.
and then became a symbol of what an inclusive constitution could be.
Mm-hmm.
Colombia experienced a civil war and has gone through a transitional justice process that has become, it's challenging, but it's also become a model for other countries around the world. Brazil has a very similar history to the US and today is holding its former dictator accountable.
That's right.
If we want to rebuild our reputation, it has to be with everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I really like to hear this level of ambition. You're right. We can't just go back to what we were doing before, uh, and hope that that will be sufficient to be reintegrated as a country that's respected. But I hear what you're saying, and I agree with that. Like, we need to aim for something different and use maybe this opportunity, this destruction that we've experienced, for something much bolder. Huh? and much braver. Mm. Well, thank you, Jessica. This is an incredibly interesting conversation, and I hope we can pick it up again soon. But thank you for this. We have to include everybody in human rights. We have to keep uh, making the tent bigger for human rights, and we have to use it as the driving force for our foreign policy and domestic policy. Without that, what do we have? Yeah,
What do we have indeed?
yeah,
Well, before we end, I just want to say the name of your show is so great. Feminism Makes Us Smarter. It's been my life
it's true,
motto.
isn't it?
So I'm really honored to have been invited onto your show, and thank you for trying to explain the world. As you heard me saying, I don't think the world would be in this situation if we took time to explain our ideas and values to people and welcome them in. So thank you so much for your leadership, past, present, and future.
Thank you, and thank you for yours. And a luta continua.
A luta
Luta
continua.
continua.
Bye,
Ciao.
Françoise.
Expiro, expiro.